These are notes for section 7.1. Okay, 7.1, we have 1 to 55 odd, page 363. Some problems. And up to 55, you can see there. And then the answers in the back. 7.1. You should be able to see all those there. Let me move the book a little so we can angle it better. Yeah, okay. Section 7.1, we're doing something called completing a square. Some background information first. So completing a square, I may abbreviate CTS for completing a square. First, we'll talk about square roots of negatives. Okay, the square root of -1 is defined to be I for imaginary number. It's not a real number. Okay, they actually exist. Don't think of imaginary as doesn't exist. They exist in some situations in real life, but we coined the term imaginary, something you can't put in a real number line. So the square root of -1 is defined to be I, or I squared is equal to -1. Some examples, the square root of -4 is the square root of -1 times 4, which I can break up into square root of -1 times the square root of 4. And the square root of -1 is I, square root of 4 is 2, so 2I. So in other words, the square root of -4, the shortcut is when you see the negative, just take it outside as an I, and then 2I. Okay? So for positive A, our shortcut is if you have the square root of -A, take out the negative and stand it up as an I radical A. Here's an example, square root of -7. Take this out, I radical 7. Square root of -9, I radical 9, but radical 9 is 3, so 3I. And we'll define something called a complex number. 2 plus 3I is called a complex number. This is the real part, this is the imaginary part. So in general, complex numbers are the form A plus BI, where A and B are real. I is this imaginary number, square root of -1. Okay, then we have something called the square root property. Question 1, x squared equals 25. You might take the square root of both sides, quote unquote. That's okay, except you have to remember there's a plus or minus. So x is plus or minus 5, meaning 5 or -5, because if you take a look, 5 works, but -5 also works. -5 squared is equal to 25 also. So in general, if you have x squared equals k, then x is equal to plus or minus k. Okay, so let's say if you have x squared equals 7, x is plus or minus the square root of 7. Okay, number 3, a squared equals -9. So take the square root. You have a is plus or minus the square root of -9. The negative means take it outside as an I. So I radical 9 is 3I. So the answer is a equals plus or minus 3I. Okay, 4a squared minus 45 equals 0. Add 45. Subtract 4. Then by the square root property, a is plus or minus the square root of 45 over 4. Okay, that's real this time because I'm not taking the square root of negative. Square root of 4 is 2. So I have a is plus or minus the square root of 45 over 2. 45 I can think of as 9 times 5. Okay, so 9 times 5, 9 will come outside and become a 3. So best final answer is plus or minus 3 radical 5 over 2. We'll be doing more of this type of problem later. Okay, 15. The original was 5x plus 2 squared equals a -8. So we know there's some imaginary number involved because of the fact that you're taking the square root of a negative. So square root, plus or minus in red. 5x plus 2 equals plus or minus I radical 8. And the square root of a negative, take out the negative and becomes an I. Okay. And 8 is 4 times 2. So write it like this. The 4 will come inside and change to a 2. So 5x plus 2 equals plus or minus 2I radical 2. Subtract 2 on both sides and divide 5. So coming over here, final answer x is -2 plus or minus 2I radical 2 all over 5. Okay, 19, 4a squared minus 12a plus 9 equals -4. Okay, this is a perfect square. It's 2a minus 3 quantity squared equals a negative, so you know there's going to be a complex number, this imaginary stuff. So square root property, so 2a minus 3, take off the square root in the square, plus or minus square root of -4, I radical 4. Radical 4 is 2, so so plus or minus 2i. Add 3 to both sides. 2a equals 3 plus or minus 2i. Divide by 2. So a equals 3 plus or minus 2i over 2. Now keep in mind that actually represents two solutions. The plus or minus means 3 minus 2i over 2 or 3 plus 2i over 2. This is just a more complex, compact way of saying the same thing. Okay, now we have something called completing the square. Okay, so the key idea is to take half and square of the coefficient of x, half and square. So what's this half and square stuff? So 21, it just says x squared plus 12x, and they want you to complete the square. Add something so that you get a perfect square. So what you do is take half the coefficient of x and square it. So half of 12 is 6, and then the square part, 6 squared, is 36. So in red, they want you to add 36, and that should factor into a perfect square. In other words, it's blah, blah, blah squared. What is that square? It's x plus 6 squared. Okay, we'll practice some more of those. 25, a squared minus 10a. So in red, I have what the answer is. Take half the coefficient of a. Half of negative 10 is negative 5. Square negative 5, you get 25. So you add 25, and what is that perfect square? A minus 5 squared. Okay, this one's a little harder. 29, y squared minus 7y. So take half of negative 7 over 2, square it, positive 49 over 4. By the way, this will always be a positive because you're squaring here. So 49 over 4, what is a perfect square? Now, if you don't know how to do this, just put the square root of this right here, the square root of this over here, and keep this sign. In other words, square root of y squared is y. Square root of 49 over 4 is 7 over 2. This is a minus, this is a minus. If it were a plus, I would keep it a plus. So y minus 7 halves squared. Okay, 33, x squared plus 2/3 x. So half and square, half of 2/3, 1/3. 1/3 squared is 1/9. So I will add 1/9. And then what is a perfect square? Well, just give me the square root of this, x. The square root of 1/9 is 1/3. Keep that sign, so it's a positive. Okay, now we're supposed to solve some problems by completing a square. Okay, so solve by completing a square. X squared plus 4x equals 12. Okay, so I do the half and square business to figure out what I add to both sides. Okay, it's going to end up being 4 in red. Why is it 4? Take half the coefficient of x. Half of 4 is 2. 2 squared is 4. Add 4, add 4. Now this factors into a perfect square, x plus 2 squared. 12 plus 4 is 16. So x plus 2 squared equals 16. Square root, plus or minus. X plus 2 equals plus or minus 4. Subtract 2 on both sides. X is negative 2 plus or minus 4. So negative 2 minus 4 is negative 6. Negative 2 plus 4, 2. Okay, and by the way, this one you said, well, I could have just factored it. True. X squared plus 4x minus 12 equals 0, and factor and get x equals negative 6 and 2. That works if you can factor your expression, but if you cannot factor, you have to do completing the square. Completing the square will work all the time. Okay, now 39, you were not able to factor this, so you cannot do it by factoring, but you can still do completing the square. A squared minus 2a plus 5 equals 0. First, put the constant on the other side. Subtract the 5. Okay, then complete the square on a squared minus 2a. So half and square. Half of negative 2 is negative 1. Negative 1 squared is 1. So I add 1 to both sides. That'll make this a negative 4. And what is this perfect square? A minus 1 squared. So now I do the square root stuff, and there's a negative, so there's going to be some I involved, you know. So a minus 1 equals plus or minus, take out the negative, I radical 4. Radical 4 is 2. So a minus 1 is plus or minus 2i. Add 1 to both sides. A is 1 plus or minus 2i. Here's 43. X squared minus 5x minus 3 equals 0. Add 3 to both sides. Okay, this one's a little bit harder. Complete the square. So half of negative 5, negative 5 over 2. Square negative 5 over 2, 25 over 4. So 25 over 4, 25 over 4. 3 is like 3 over 1. So in green, to get a common denominator, multiply by 4 over 4. Right? 3 times 4 is 12. 12 plus 25 is 37. So the right-hand side is now 37 over 4. This mess factors into x minus 5/2 squared. How do I do it? Square root of this, x. Square root of 25 over 4, 5 over 2. Keep this sign. Don't look at this sign. This sign's always positive. So minus here means minus here. So x minus 5 squared equals 37 over 4. Square root, plus or minus. X minus 5/2 is plus or minus. No I needed. Don't need an I because there's no negative. Square root of 37 can't do anything, but the square root of 4 is 2. And then add 5 over 2 to both sides. It's going to look like this. 5 over 2 plus or minus radical 37 over 2, or x is 5 plus or minus radical 37 over 2. Okay, 45. All the problems for completing the square, the leading coefficient, which means the coefficient in front of the x squared, is supposed to be 1. So we want it like that, just x squared. So what happens if there's a 2? Just divide both sides by 2. Okay? If there's a 3, I'm going to divide both sides by 3. Okay? So completing the squared, you want the coefficient in front of the squared term to be 1. So divide by 2. X squared minus 2x minus 4 equals 0. 0 divided by 2 is 0. Okay, the rest is pretty much the same. Okay, so complete the square. Add 4 to both sides. Half and square. Half of negative 2, negative 1. Negative 1 squared is 1. So I add 1 to both sides. 4 plus 1 is 5. This factors in x minus 1 squared. Square root, plus or minus. X minus 1 is plus or minus radical 5. Add 1. So x is 1 plus or minus radical 5. And finally, 47. 3t squared minus 8t plus 1 equals 0. Again, I don't want the 3 here, so I just divide by 3. 3 divided by 3, 1. So t squared minus 8/3 t plus 1/3 equals 0 divided by 3 is 0. Okay, so subtract 1/3 on both sides, negative 1/3. Do the half and square stuff, complete the square. So complete the square is half and square. I'll show that to you, but anyway. Okay, so half of negative 8/3 is negative 4/3. Negative 4/3 squared is 16 over 9. So I add 16 over 9 to both sides. So negative 1/3, multiply top and bottom in green by 3 over 3 to get a common denominator. So the denominator is now 9 on both of them. So I have negative 3 plus 16, which is 13. How do I factorize that? What's the square root of t squared? T. What's the square root of 16 over 9? 4/3. Minus here means minus. If it was a plus, it's a plus. Square root, plus or minus. T minus 4/3 is plus or minus. Square root of 13, leave it alone. Square root of 9 is 3. And then add 4/3. So t is equal to 4/3 plus or minus radical 13 over 3, or 4 plus or minus radical 13 over 3. Okay, so this is completing the square. The concept is half and square. Take half the coefficient of x and then square it for these problems. Yeah, this is what I was going to show you, half and square. All right, so these are notes for section 7.1.